here in America, and I find it in almost every conversation I have with pundits in TV studios and with faculty members on campus, we need to provide the real context. I'd like to take a minute of your time to talk about what happened to the Israeli public in the last 12 years. There were three dramatic turns of events in the history of our region in the last 12 years that lead to this enormous disappointment. The first took place in the summer of the year 2000. Up until that point, we operated under the assumption that essentially between Israelis and Palestinians, there's a very simple bargain on the table. You give them land, that's what they want, and what you will get in return is what you want, namely peace and security. President Clinton made the first attempt to put that assumption to the test of reality. While Israel Prime Minister said yes, you all know that the Palestinians said no, and immediately thereafter waged war against Israeli civilians. 72% of Israel's 1,200 victims, fatalities, and 7,500 casualties during the Second Intifada were civilians. This was not war only against Israeli soldiers. Palestinians made a strategic decision to target civilians. The second huge event of huge historical importance took place in the summer of 2005. The most unlikely person to pull out of Gaza, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, did just that. He not only pulled out of Gaza, he gave back every square inch of land to the Palestinians, uprooting thousands of Israelis, demolishing 25 thriving Jewish communities, practically handing over the key to the Palestinians, telling them, Gaza is all yours. Turn it into a flourishing, booming society, community, city, county, what have you. Turn it into a tourism destination. Turn it into an industrial zone. Do something with it for the benefit of the Palestinian people, for their future. But instead, the Palestinians turned Gaza into one big ammunition dump. They turned Gaza into one big weaponry depot and a launching pad to attack attacks against Israel time and again. In 7 years that passed since 2005, we had to endure over 12,000 rockets. I was on a conference call with the mayor of Sderot, David Buskila, who shared with the listeners that his little town of 25,000 people had to suffer 8,000 rockets and missiles in 7 years. What country, what government would allow that, let alone a democratically elected government? And then the third major turning point took place in 2008, when Israel's Prime Minister at the time, Ehud Olmert, presented a deal to the Palestinians that would have given them 100% of all of their territorial demands, and the answer was no again. The string of those three dramatic events convinced most Israelis, although they support the two-state solution. If you'll ask Israelis today, there's a solid majority among Israelis that will tell you, yes, we think the two-state solution is the only viable solution. But at the same time, they'll tell you, we believe the conflict is not just about land. Because if it was about land, we could have solved it a long time ago. There's something else. And most Israelis today will question the logic behind the territorial deal on the table. And they'll tell you, we fear that the unfinished business between us and the Palestinians is not the 1967 war, which was over boundaries and land, but rather the 1948 war, which was over our very right to exist. And if this is the case, It requires a whole different degree of perseverance and resilience. I talked about it this morning at the New York Stock Exchange, how we should look at the performance of the Israeli stock market to measure Israeli resilience. When Israel went into Lebanon in 2006, stock market was hardly affected. When we went into Gaza in 2009, the stock market was hardly affected. And today, Tel Aviv 25 index actually went up. These are the facts. These are the people we are. This is the unique Israeli spirit, one of perseverance and resilience. Hamas, a terrorist organization that rules Gaza, refuses to accept our right to exist. That's where it begins, and that's where it ends. Operation Pillar of Defense is meant to do one thing, and one thing only. It's not meant to destroy the Palestinian Gaza Strip. It's not meant to destroy their infrastructure. It's meant to do one thing and one thing only: to remove the strategic threat posed by Hamas rockets and missiles.
Would you comment on what is happening sort of today, and just in terms of the question of, do you think that peace is possible at all, ever, between Israel and the Palestinians?
I think if we look back at the record, the only time when there is a willingness to make peace is when they see themselves as confronting a greater danger. When Egypt was becoming a Soviet colony, that was a good incentive for the Egyptians to make peace, and Sadat was very willing to do so. I think we are, when we are now approaching, I think, a similar situation, and it may be possible again. I would describe my position as cautiously optimistic, but whether negotiations are not likely to succeed depends on one crucial question. What is the dispute about? If the dispute is about the frontiers of Israel, about the size of Israel, then it becomes a nice, simple question like Texas or Alsace-Lorraine. And after several wars and endless negotiations, one can eventually arrive at a compromise solution. If, on the other hand, the conflict is about the existence of Israel, should Israel exist or should it not, then obviously there is no possible compromise. There is no compromise between existing and not existing. And as long as the conflict is about that, obviously there is no hope of peace at all. One can only hope that at some point there will be a willingness to accept the existence of Israel, at which point it becomes a nice, normal, simple conflict.
I think the important thing, there are two subjects that I'll briefly address. One is about what's going on. And I think for American audiences, it's very important to understand that despite the information revolution and despite the fact that we have all these instant information sources, cable, internet, millions of apps that give you all the news instantly, even before it happens, whatever, that you cannot believe what you read, you cannot believe what you hear, and you cannot believe what you see. With the exception of a few publications like the Wall Street Journal, the Daily News for Mort, the New York Post, Fox, I don't know who else took ads, but for all of those too, that the fact is that we have seen this war brought to us live, and yet the distortions, misrepresentations, and misinformation continue. That we see pictures on the front pages of the newspapers of record showing dead children who were killed in the Syrian war, who were killed by a Hamas missile, who were killed 7 years ago in a car accident in Gaza unrelated to Israel. And that people accept immediately these charges, the continuing talk of occupation when it ended 7 years ago. Has any of them read a history book? Has any of them gotten any context about what in reality this is? This is not a war about territory, as you pointed out. This is a war about Israel's right to exist. That's the challenge. And it's part of the global campaign of delegitimization. It's part of the effort to deny Israel the right to defend its citizens, a right granted every other country. It's the first responsibility of every country. And to deny the Jewish state that right is to deny it the standing of others and to deny Jews the rights of others. And I see this as part of that campaign of delegitimization, where you see the comparisons of an IDF that has the weapons of mass destruction but uses it for pinpoint strikes. That they have the weapons that could have, perhaps in a day or two, solved this whole issue. Carpet bombing, which other countries have done, democracies have done. And yet instead, they take out a missile site between two buildings that both remain intact. It's a story that is not being told correctly. And I think it's very important for all of us, and those of us who value truth and who know the situation, and there's no one better than Senator Mitchell here who can attest to the complexity of this issue. We all recognize it. But the facts are the facts. Israel's strongest weapon is the truth. And I think it can stand the test of any country. And I believe Israel should be judged by a higher standard, not a double standard, not an impossible standard as we see today. And I think it is imperative for us to speak up. And, you know, I think it was remarkable that for 12,000 missiles, 2,500 since 2009, 900 this year before the fighting began, and not a word of condemnation from the Human Rights Council, the United Nations Security Council, none of these bodies. But at the same time, thousands of Christians have been killed from Malaysia to Lebanon, in Egypt, in Iraq, in Iran, in Syria, and not a word. They hang them from cranes in Iran for nothing but professing their religion. And the world is silent. What have we learned in 70 years? With the same indifference, the same apathy? And the only ones who speak out, frankly, are the Jews. Because we know that a world that is indifferent to them is indifferent to us. So I think that this war should be a lesson to us, that we have to stand up. If we really care about democratic values, this war is about America's future too. This is the war against terror. This is the front line. Israel's carried the burden for 60 years alone. And too often we forget that it is defending the United States, not just the United States defending Israel. And I want to just make one more point about the election, which Kenny asked us to address somewhere in the beginning of this. The election's over, so get over it. We have to look at the realities. This is a changing America. There are going to be many challenges. But fundamentally, the American people are with Israel. More than 2/3 of the American people clearly declare themselves. It is overwhelming. They get it. Despite the misreporting and distortions and misrepresentations, they get it. They understand what Israel stands for. They understand the values and the shared interests. They understand that Israel's battle is America's battle. It's reflected in the Iron Dome, this magnificent instrument that is a result of U.S.-Israel collaboration. We saw it recently in the thousands of Marines coming to Israel, working and exercising together with American troops and the operations that were annually done. Those stories don't make headlines. When thousands of troops and 17 American ships are in the Haifa port, you don't see it on the front page of the papers. The overwhelming commonality of interests and values between the United States and Israel overwhelm any of the temporary differences. And no matter who the president is, we have a bedrock in Congress. And you know, the truth is that presidents are pro-Israel by and large. And the presidents of the United States reflect the feelings of the American people. Sometimes they get off the way a little bit. So it's our job to bring them back. But fundamentally, we have to educate people. We have to continue to remind them of the lessons of the past, to remind them of our responsibilities, that this is the battle for America. And what you said is very important. This is not Egypt and Turkey. This is Egypt and Turkey trying to create a Sunni crescent. It's Iran trying to create a Shiite crescent. This is a battle of four empires, the Persian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim Brotherhood Empire, the Wahhabi Empire, over who will control the Middle East. And what is it that prevents it? That little sliver of land that stands there as America's aircraft carrier, the place we can pre-position $2 billion in goods and know it'll be there when we need it. So we can stand proud in the U.S.-Israel relationship. With whatever differences exist, you know, we glorify presidents. Elie Wiesel, our great leader, is here, and he can tell you the meeting I organized, and he came when President Reagan was going to go to Bitburg. And he made that very famous speech about, "This is not your place, Mr. President." He also did AWACS. He was a great friend, but there are always differences. It's in the nature of any relationship. But fundamentally, we're there The Congress votes more than 90% on any bill in Israel. They don't vote for motherhood in 90%, only when it comes to Israel, because it reflects America's values, America's interests, and America's future.
I want to make one preliminary comment that really is a footnote to what you just said, but it'll be a takeaway if you just do the math. The other day I was reading a story in a major metropolitan newspaper that is not the Journal or the Daily News or the Post, some other paper, which referred to Gaza as intensely crowded. Now, Gaza has a population of 1.7 million people in an area the size of 141 square miles. That works out to 12,000 people per square mile. I used to live in Brussels. Brussels has 17,000 people per square mile. Many of you have visited Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv has 20,000 people per square mile. New York City, where we are now, minus commuters and tourists, has 26,000 people per square mile, and Karachi has 44,000 people per square mile. That's math, very simple arithmetic. I just wanted to point it out as an example of the routine way in which this entire story is being badly misreported to make Gaza seem as if it is a unique enclave of poverty and degradation, which to anyone who has visited Gaza, and many of us in this room know is simply not true. Compare Gaza to any city in Egypt, and Gaza will look relatively good. Now, let me make just a few broader points. A few weeks ago, I had the honor of listening to a speech by Daniel Kahneman, the great Israeli Nobel Prize-winning economist. And Kahneman's advice to a group of businessmen and investors from Israel and the United States is that it always pays to have at least one pessimist in your room. It especially pays, as I know this as a speaker at Jewish events, to be the pessimist as the speaker, because no Jewish audience is fully satisfied unless they leave totally depressed. So I feel I have an obligation for your sake, Ken, and AIFL's sake, to be a little pessimistic. You know, it's commonplace to talk about the fact that in X year, the challenges that Israel faces are unique, extraordinary, unprecedented. 2012 actually fits that bill for what I want to say are three principal reasons. One, as you're all familiar, is the rise of nuclear Islamism. That is to say, you can have various kinds of debates as to whether Iran simply wants a threshold nuclear capability or a full nuclear capability, or what kind of threshold capability it wants. But you now have the world's most aggressive Islamist state coming very close to becoming at least a threshold nuclear power. And as everyone in this room is familiar with the argument, at a minimum, that means a spiral of nuclear proliferation throughout the most volatile region in the world. I'm encouraged when I listen, and I say this as an editorial board member for the Wall Street Journal, I'm encouraged when I listen to President Obama clearly state that he understands that as a president committed to non-proliferation, the idea of allowing Iran to get so close to a bomb and creating this cascade of proliferation isn't simply a direct threat to Israeli security. It's a direct threat to this administration's basic goals in foreign policy, and it's a direct threat to the United States. That moment is approaching. People have been talking about the approach of nuclear Iran for a long time. We're really getting there. And there's a lot of conversation, especially now, saying, well, you know, we really need to exhaust every last possible avenue of diplomacy, sanctions, and so on, which is a fair enough comment, but I would just point out that it was in August 2002, more than 10 years ago, that we first became aware of the presence of the nuclear conversion and enrichment facilities all of them underground facilities until they were disclosed. So, to quote W.H. Auden, it has been a low dishonest decade when it comes to Iran's bid to become a nuclear power. So we have on the one hand this movement towards nuclear Islamism. The next thing that we see, and this is something much newer, well, not that much newer, but especially pronounced in the last 2 years, is the rise of democratic Islamism. Now, it started in Turkey, again, exactly 10 years ago, with the rise of the AKP party under Prime Minister Erdogan, then with the Palestinians in 2006, then with Hezbollah in Lebanon in 2010, but it really exploded in a big way in 2011, 2012, with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, this is a potent fact in the life of the region. It's a potent fact for us in the United States because previously Islamism, for all of its popularity and all of its ideological ambition, didn't have one of the things that it craved the most, which was political legitimacy. It's much more difficult to contend with a form of Islamism that suddenly has that political legitimacy that elections uniquely bestow. And I think it's important for us in the West to say, and say clearly, that it's not simply democracy that we ought to aspire to from Ramallah and Gaza to Cairo and Tunis. It's liberalism. That is, the values that we share when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to the rights of free speech, when it comes to gay rights, when it comes to tolerance, when it comes to pluralism. Those are the values, and by the way, it's no longer true that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, but it remains true that Israel is the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. That's a point that needs to be brought home. But we have this twin movement of nuclear Islamism and democratic Islamism, and I think it's pressing in on Israel and pressing in on the foreign policy of the United States in a very urgent way. I want to make one final point, and I think this is important to make and maybe isn't made enough, which is that there are a set of values and practices, not only within the Israeli government, but also the Jewish community, that worry me a great deal. It worries me that the Israeli leadership appears to have had a highly public, nervous breakdown when it comes to the question of what it intends to do vis-a-vis Iran. Now, it's one thing to maintain a posture of ambiguity about whether Israel will strike or won't strike Iran's nuclear facilities. It's a very different thing to have a posture of ambiguity as to whether Israel can or cannot strike Iran's facilities. And this very public spat between the head of Mossad and Shin Bet and the political leaders in Israel is a bad thing. Everyone understands the stereotype, one Israeli, two opinions, or whatever, 1.5 opinions, something like that.
3 synagogues.
It's not funny. It's not funny when you're ultimately talking about the cohesion with which the Israeli government operates. It's not funny either when so many senior Israeli political figures feel they're entitled to come to Washington and conduct a freelance diplomacy that is not necessarily in accord with what the elected government's diplomacy is. An elected government ought to have the benefit of some kind of relatively coherent policy when it comes to dealing with its major partners and allies. The second point that I think is important to make is that while you can't but be wowed by the success of Iron Dome and Israel's technological prowess in defeating the current military threat, you cannot technologicize, to coin a word, your way to a coherent strategy vis-a-vis Palestinians, vis-a-vis the wider Arab world. And I worry about an Israel that always thinks that there's going to be some immensely clever technological fix that will be able to solve problems that, for a variety of reasons, they don't otherwise want to solve. The basic problem in Gaza is that you have a terrorist organization that is putting down roots in that territory, and you have weakening will to sever those roots, to cut those roots. We are, to use Daniel Patrick Moynihan's wonderful phrase, we are defining deviancy down when it comes to the kinds of governments we think are acceptable for Israel to be dealing with. And we have to be wary of that trend to say, well, we're going to have to deal with the Hamas because after all they're there and the costs of getting rid of them are high, et cetera, et cetera. I think Israel has to be very careful about that process. And a final point I want to make is that much as you respect the courage and steadfastness of the people of Sderot and other communities that are most in the line of fire in Israel, it needs to be said that Sderot is a disgrace. Sderot is not a showcase for Israel. It is a disgrace for Israel because it is a demonstration that the state is not capable of effectively defending its citizens. So there isn't an event that I go to, a Jewish event, where there isn't a video about the brave people of Sderot and massive investments and concrete bunkers and children who now live in giant, have new basketball facilities or whatever that are well defended. But all of that reflects the fact that the fire still is incoming. And that's not acceptable. The purpose of, and I say this again and again, the purpose of a Jewish state is not to showcase Jewish victimization. The purpose of a Jewish state is to end Jewish victimization. I don't think that point can be brought home strongly enough. Now, all of that being said, one final point. It's very easy when you're confronted with radical, despotic regimes like the Hamas, like Iran, to take note of all of their strengths while you obsess about your own weaknesses. Because open societies, by their nature, think about their own weaknesses, whereas closed societies don't give you a picture of their weaknesses. That's what they do as closed societies. So we imagine that China has no problems, that its economic growth, for instance, is constantly moving upward. And so it went with the Soviet Union and other despotic societies. But in the long run, open societies, because they're flexible, because they're adaptive, and because they're able to openly discuss their own problems, as we are doing here tonight, have a way of vanquishing their enemies. What they need is courage, wit, nerve, faith, and a sense of humor. Thank you very much.